When Langston Reed, a successful black CEO, visits the small town of Millbrook to propose a redevelopment project, he faces blatant racism and hostility from Sheriff Grayson, a corrupt lawman determined to protect his grip on power. Langston quickly uncovers a deeply entrenched system of prejudice, corruption, and intimidation aimed at silencing anyone who challenges the status quo. As Grayson escalates his attempts to humiliate and threaten Langston, the story exposes the raw realities of racism in America and the abuse of authority, leaving viewers enraged at the injustices Langston must endure in his fight for truth and justice. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Reuben Walker's wrists as he stood on the cracked pavement outside his small hardware store. The quiet neighborhood was alive with whispers, residents peeking from behind faded curtains and dimly lit porches. Red and blue lights danced on the street, casting jagged shadows that felt like prison bars. "You fit the description," the officer barked, tightening the cuffs. His voice carried that clipped authority, laced with something venomous. Reuben kept his chin high, his deep-set eyes unflinching as they met the officer's glare. "The description of what?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing lump in his throat. "A thief," the officer shot back. "Saw you running near 5th and Main." Reuben frowned. "I was closing up my shop, you can check the cameras." "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped, shoving him toward the squad car. The metal door of the patrol car opened with a groan, but Reuben didn't move. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly, "but I'm not getting in that car until you tell me what I've done." The officer's grip on his arm tightened. "You people always think you're above the law." That was when Reuben's wife, Naomi, appeared on the sidewalk, her phone raised. "I'm recording this," she announced, her voice trembling with fear but steady with purpose. The officer froze, his jaw clenching. Reuben turned his head slightly, enough to catch Naomi's eyes. They shared a silent moment, one of understanding and determination. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a test of their resilience. The morning light filtered through the wide windows of the small-town diner, casting golden hues over the cracked vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with sizzling bacon, the soundtrack to an ordinary day in Millbrook. It was the kind of place where conversations drifted softly between bites of pancakes, and where faces, whether familiar or not, always drew second glances. At a corner booth sat Langston Reed, a man whose presence seemed almost out of place in the quaint setting. His tailored charcoal suit hung effortlessly on his broad shoulders, the crisp white shirt underneath opened casually at the collar. Langston wasn't a man who needed to flaunt his wealth or status. His quiet confidence spoke louder than any luxury watch ever could, yet the faint glint of his understated cufflinks hinted at the kind of life most in Millbrook could only dream of. Langston was one of the wealthiest black CEOs in the country, the driving force behind a tech conglomerate that had reshaped industries. But despite his towering success, he preferred the simpler pleasures. A quiet morning at a small-town diner with a mug of black coffee in hand, a break from the high-stakes chaos of corporate boardrooms. This wasn't about nostalgia or appearances. For Langston, it was about grounding himself, remembering the man he'd been before the world added titles to his name. "Anything else for you, sugar?" the waitress asked, her tone friendly but distracted as she refilled his coffee cup. "No thank you, Sarah," Langston replied, offering a small smile. He'd taken the time to learn her name on his first visit, a small gesture that surprised her. Most patrons, particularly those passing through town, didn't bother. But Langston wasn't like most. Sarah lingered for a second longer than necessary, her gaze flickering to the other end of the diner, where a group of men sat. They were locals, by the look of their worn boots and weathered faces, sharing a round of early morning banter. Their laughter came in sharp bursts, but every so often one would glance toward Langston, muttering something under his breath that sparked a new round of chuckles. Langston noticed, of course, but he didn't react. His years navigating boardrooms filled with skeptics and navigating public spaces filled with unspoken biases had trained him to pick his battles. He focused instead on his phone, scrolling through emails while taking another sip of his coffee. The diner's door jingled as it swung open, bringing with it a rush of cool autumn air. Langston glanced up briefly and froze. Sheriff Daniel Grayson strolled in, his boots clicking against the floor with deliberate weight. The air in the diner shifted slightly, conversations growing quieter as the sheriff made his way to the counter. Grayson was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. His uniform was pressed, the badge on his chest gleaming, like it had just been polished. To the town of Millbrook, Grayson was both protector and enforcer, a man whose authority went unquestioned. Except Langston Reed wasn't from Millbrook. Grayson ordered his coffee, his voice low, but carrying the same quiet command he brought to every room he entered. As he turned, his eyes landed on Langston. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Langston could feel the weight of the sheriff's scrutiny, as if Grayson were trying to place him, or perhaps judge him. Grayson moved toward Langston's booth, his boots echoing like a drumbeat on the floor. The diner's patrons watched silently, their curiosity thinly veiled behind their mugs of coffee and menus. "Morning," Grayson said, stopping just short of Langston's table. His tone wasn't impolite, but it carried an edge of authority, as though he expected answers before questions had even been asked. "Good morning," Langston replied, setting his phone down. "You're not from around here," Grayson said, his gaze unwavering. "No, I'm not," Langston replied evenly. "Just passing through." Grayson tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Passing through, huh? You don't seem like the usual tourist we get here." Langston's smile was faint, measured. "I suppose I'm not." The silence stretched between them, heavy and deliberate. Grayson's presence was calculated, each pause an assertion of dominance. "What brings you to Millbrook?" Grayson finally asked, crossing his arms. Langston glanced briefly at the waitress, who had stopped mid-pour at another table to watch the exchange. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. "Business," Langston replied, leaning back in his seat. "I'm considering some investment opportunities in the area." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Investment in Millbrook?" He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before." "There's potential everywhere," Langston said simply. "Sometimes you just have to look harder to see it." Grayson's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Well, let me give you some advice, Mr. Reed," Langston said, offering his hand. Grayson didn't take it. "Mr. Reed," Grayson continued, "Millbrook isn't exactly the kind of place that takes kindly to outsiders sticking their noses where they don't belong." Langston's gaze didn't waver. "I appreciate your advice, Sheriff, but I assure you, my interests here are purely professional." Grayson held his stare for a beat longer, before finally stepping back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he said, his tone making it sound more like a warning than a pleasantry. As Grayson turned and walked back toward the counter, Langston exhaled quietly, his composure unbroken. He wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of encounter, the subtle posturing, the quiet implication that he didn't belong, but it never failed to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. The diner slowly returned to life as Grayson took his coffee and left, the tension ebbing away like a receding tide. But Langston knew this was only the beginning. The sheriff's veiled hostility was a warning shot, a sign of things to come. As Langston paid his bill and stepped outside, the brisk air hit his face, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The quiet streets of Millbrook seemed almost peaceful, but Langston could feel the undercurrent of something deeper, something restless. He glanced across the street at the old courthouse, its stone facade weathered but proud. He had a meeting there later that day, one that could change the course of Millbrook's future, or put him directly in the crosshairs of those who wanted to keep things exactly as they were. Langston straightened his jacket and started walking, his steps deliberate. He'd faced challenges before, and he'd overcome them all. But as he moved through the quiet streets of Millbrook, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle would be unlike any he'd fought before. Langston Reed walked toward the courthouse, the chill in the air sharp, but invigorating. As he neared the building, a young mother pushing a stroller passed him on the sidewalk. She offered a polite nod, though her pace quickened ever so slightly. Langston noticed these things, the small gestures, the subtle changes in energy. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The practiced awareness of someone who knew the world, often saw him first as a threat, and second as a man. The courthouse steps were worn smooth from years of use, and the weight of history seemed to press down with each step he took inside. The grand rotunda echoed with the shuffle of papers and the murmur of conversations. Langston adjusted his tie and strode toward the clerk's desk, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Behind the counter, an older man with silver hair and a pair of half-moon glasses perched on his nose barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, his tone clipped, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers. "Yes," Langston said, keeping his voice measured. "I have an appointment with Judge Holloway Langston Reed." The clerk's fingers stilled, his eyes finally lifting to meet Langston's. They lingered a second too long, scanning him as though searching for discrepancies between the polished man before him and whatever preconceptions he held. "Judge Holloway doesn't typically meet with the public," the clerk said, his voice carrying an edge of skepticism. "I'm not the public," Langston replied, his tone steady. "I'm here regarding a proposal for the redevelopment project we've spoken at length." The clerk adjusted his glasses, his expression cooling. "Of course," he said, though the pause before the words betrayed his reluctance. "I'll let her know you're here. Have a seat." Langston nodded, moving to the benches lining the hallway. As he sat, he became acutely aware of the sideways glances from passers-by, curious, suspicious, even dismissive. He could feel their unspoken questions. Who is he? Why is he here? Doesn't he know his place? The minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour. Langston's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He sent a quick text to his assistant, confirming a later meeting in the city, then leaned back against the bench. A younger man in a rumpled suit, a junior attorney by the look of him, walked by, sparing Langston a glance before muttering under his breath, "Guess they'll let anyone in these days." Langston's grip on his phone tightened, but he didn't respond. It was an old tactic. Let the comments roll off, stay focused, yet each moment of inaction felt like a concession, a piece of himself given up to maintain the fragile peace. "Mr. Reed?" a voice finally called. Langston looked up to see a bailiff standing at the end of the hallway, a burly man with a closely cropped beard and a face that seemed carved from stone. "Judge Holloway will see you now." Langston rose, smoothing the front of his jacket, and walked past the clerk's desk, where the older man avoided his gaze. The bailiff led him down a quiet corridor to a set of double doors. He pushed them open, motioning Langston inside. The judge's chambers were spacious but unpretentious, lined with bookshelves and decorated with muted tones. Behind the desk sat Judge Miriam Holloway, a woman in her early 60s with sharp features and an air of no-nonsense authority. "Mr. Reed," she said, rising to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, her expression neutral. "Please, have a seat." "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Langston said as he sat. "I've read your proposal," she began, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "Ambitious, to say the least." Langston nodded. "Ambition is necessary when change is overdue." Her lips twitched, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Millbrook isn't exactly known for embracing change, Mr. Reed." "I've noticed," he replied, allowing a hint of wryness to color his tone. She leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "You've made quite a name for yourself, Mr. Reed. But Millbrook is... Different people here have their ways. They like things as they are." Langston met her gaze, unflinching. "Their ways have left this town stagnant. Crime rates are high, infrastructure is crumbling. The redevelopment project would bring jobs, resources, and opportunities." Holloway tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. "And yet, there's resistance." "I'm not here to change minds overnight," Langston said. "I'm here to offer solutions." The judge considered this, then leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Reed. There are powerful people in this town who won't take kindly to your involvement, Sheriff Grayson for one." Langston's expression didn't change, but her words confirmed what he'd already suspected. "I've dealt with resistance before, Judge Holloway. I didn't come this far to back down now." Holloway's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "Just be careful. Millbrook doesn't play fair." As Langston left the chambers, he felt the weight of her warning settle over him. The hallway seemed quieter now, the earlier hum of activity replaced by a stifling stillness. He was halfway to the exit when he saw them. Two officers standing by the front doors, talking in low tones. One of them glanced up, his gaze locking onto Langston's. "Mr. Reed, is it?" the officer called, his tone carrying a forced politeness. Langston paused, nodding once. "You got a minute?" the officer continued, stepping forward. His partner followed, both of them flanking Langston as though corralling him. Langston's instincts flared, but he kept his expression neutral. "Is there an issue?" he asked. "We've had some complaints," the first officer said, his smile thin and humorless. "Said you've been asking a lot of questions around town." Langston raised an eyebrow. "Is that a crime?" The second officer chuckled, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Depends who you're asking." Langston took a step back, forcing them to adjust their positions. "If you have a question for me, I'd suggest you ask it directly. Otherwise, I have somewhere to be." The first officer's smile faded, replaced by a harder edge. "We're just making sure everything's in order, you know how it is." Langston met his gaze, unblinking. "I do," he said quietly. "Far too well." The tension between them hung thick in the air, drawing the attention of the clerk and a few others nearby. Finally, the officers stepped aside, but not without a lingering look that spoke louder than words. As Langston walked out of the courthouse, his jaw tightened. The message was clear. They were watching. But as he stepped into the cool autumn air, he resolved not to let their intimidation tactics derail him. Millbrook was a town that thrived on fear, but Langston Reed had built his life defying expectations, and he wasn't about to stop now. The day wore on with an uneasy stillness, each hour sharpening the tension that hung over Langston's visit to Millbrook. By the time he arrived at his next meeting, a gathering with local business owners in a modest conference room on the outskirts of town, the weight of the courthouse encounter still pressed on his mind. Langston adjusted his tie as he entered the room, his confident stride masking the simmering frustration beneath a dozen or so business owners sat around the long oak table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. At the head of the table sat Hank Mullen, a portly man with thinning hair and a booming laugh that seemed at odds with the coldness in his eyes. "Mr. Reed," Hank said, rising to shake Langston's hand. His grip was firm, his smile tight. "We've heard a lot about you." "Hopefully good things," Langston replied smoothly, taking a seat. "Well," Hank began, leaning back in his chair, "depends who you ask. Folks here are proud of our town. Change makes some people nervous." "I understand that," Langston said, his tone measured. "But change can also bring opportunity. Better infrastructure, new jobs, increased investment, that's what the redevelopment project is about." A murmur rippled through the room. Langston could see the skepticism etched on their faces, the unspoken biases bubbling just beneath the surface. "And what guarantees do we have," one man piped up, "that this project isn't just a cash grab, that once the work's done, the town won't be left worse off?" Langston met the man's gaze. "The guarantees are in the transparency of the process. Every decision, every dollar spent, would be made public. This project isn't about me, it's about the community." The room fell quiet, but Langston could sense the undercurrent of resistance. They didn't trust him. Not because of his proposal, but because of who he was. After the meeting, Langston lingered outside, the cool air biting at his skin. He checked his phone, scrolling through emails when he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Turning, he saw Hank approaching, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his thick wool coat. "You're a smart man, Mr. Reed," Hank said, stopping a few feet away. "But you've got to understand, Millbrook isn't like the big cities you're used to." Langston studied him, sensing the weight behind the words. "I've noticed." Hank shifted his stance, lowering his voice. "There are people here who don't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who make waves." "I'm not here to make waves," Langston said, his tone firm. "I'm here to build something better." Hank sighed. "That may be, but folks around here see you as a threat. You're stirring up things they'd rather keep buried." Langston's jaw tightened. "Is that a warning?" Hank hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, and it's not just the sheriff you need to watch out for. There's more at play here than you realize." With that, Hank turned and walked away, leaving Langston with a deepening sense of unease. The trouble began that evening as Langston prepared to leave town. He'd returned to his car, parked on a quiet street near the diner, only to find 2 police cruisers blocking it. 3 officers stood nearby, their hands resting on their belts, their postures radiating hostility. "Evening, Mr. Reed," one of them drawled. It was Sheriff Grayson. "Sheriff?" Langston replied, keeping his voice calm. Is there a problem? We got a call about a suspicious vehicle, Grayson said, motioning to Langston's car. Looks like it matches the description. Langston frowned. Suspicious how? Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. You tell me. Langston felt the simmering anger rise, but he forced it down. This is my car, he said. Registered in my name. Mind if we take a look? Grayson asked, already moving toward the driver's side door. Langston stepped in front of him, his heart pounding. Without probable cause. Yes, I mind. Grayson's expression darkened, and for a moment, the air between them felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. You're awfully defensive for someone with nothing to hide. I'm defensive, Langston said evenly, because this feels less like an investigation and more like harassment. One of the other officers snickered, but Grayson raised a hand to silence him. Let's not make this difficult, Mr. Reed. Langston took a slow breath, his mind racing. If you have a warrant, show it. Otherwise, I'll be on my way. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. Fine, he said after a long pause. But don't go too far, we might have more questions. Langston didn't respond. He climbed into his car, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. As he drove away, the cruiser lights flared in his rearview mirror, trailing him until he reached the edge of town. That night, Langston sat in his hotel room, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the sheriff's actions were just the beginning. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was Mitchell Gray, an old friend and an FBI agent. Langston, Mitchell said when he answered. I got your message. What's going on? Langston explained the day's events, his voice steady but edged with frustration. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. You're in deep, Mitchell finally said. Grayson's got a reputation for keeping things tightly controlled in Millbrook. And from what you're telling me, this isn't just about you, it's about protecting whatever they've built. Langston leaned back in his chair. So what do I do? Document everything, Mitchell said. Every interaction, every threat, and don't confront them alone. If this goes south, I'll make sure you have backup. Langston nodded, the weight of the situation settling over him. Thanks, Mitchell. Be careful, Mitchell said before hanging up. Langston set the phone down and exhaled. He wasn't just fighting for his project anymore, he was fighting for his dignity, his safety, and the truth. The following morning, Langston arrived at the diner for breakfast, his usual calm demeanor masking the storm inside him. As he stepped in, the chatter died down, replaced by the faint scrape of chairs and the rustle of newspapers. He ordered his coffee and sat near the window, scanning the street outside. The tension was palpable, a low hum that vibrated just beneath the surface. He couldn't pinpoint it, but he knew something was coming. The door swung open, and Grayson stepped in, his boots heavy on the floor. He walked straight to Langston's table, his face set in a hard line. Morning, he said, his tone devoid of pleasantries. Sheriff, Langston replied, lifting his coffee cup. What can I do for you? Grayson leaned in slightly, his voice low. I'd suggest you wrap up your business and leave town, Mr. Reed. For your own good. Langston set his cup down, meeting the sheriff's gaze. Is that a threat? It's advice, Grayson said. Take it however you want. Langston held his stare, unflinching. I don't scare easily, Sheriff. Grayson straightened, his expression unreadable. Suit yourself. Just remember, Millbrook takes care of its own. As Grayson left, Langston's resolve hardened. He'd been underestimated, dismissed, and threatened, but he wouldn't back down. If the sheriff thought fear would drive him away, he was mistaken. Langston reached for his phone, his mind already strategizing. This wasn't just about standing his ground, it was about taking action. Whatever secrets Millbrook was hiding, he was going to uncover them, no matter the cost. Langston sat behind the wheel of his car, parked in the shadow of an old weathered warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook. The hum of his engine was the only sound breaking the quiet of the night. His phone sat in the cup holder, a soft glow from the screen illuminating a text message from Mitchell Gray. We've got movement, be careful. Langston had spent the last 24 hours piecing together the threads of a system that didn't just exclude him. It actively sought to crush any challenge to its fragile equilibrium. His investigation had uncovered whispers of financial records being buried, political favors traded, and a deep-rooted alliance between Grayson's office and powerful figures in the town's business elite. Yet none of it was enough to act on. Not yet. He glanced at his watch. Midnight. It was time. As Langston stepped out of his car, the sharp chill in the air was a stark reminder of what he was walking into. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation or a legal skirmish. This was personal, raw, and dangerous. He adjusted his jacket and started toward the warehouse, where faint voices and the flicker of movement signaled activity inside. The scene inside the warehouse was a sharp contrast to the quiet outside. Stacks of crates filled the space, labeled with codes that Langston recognized from the town's infrastructure contracts. This was it, the physical evidence linking Grayson's office to a network of corruption. Langston moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. He ducked behind a stack of crates, listening as voices grew louder. "You're sure this is the last of it?" a man's gruff voice asked. "Positive," another replied. "By the time anyone comes snooping, it'll be ashes." Langston's stomach turned. They weren't just hiding evidence, they were destroying it. Peeking around the edge of the crates, Langston saw 3 men, one of whom he recognized immediately: Sheriff Grayson. The sheriff stood with his arms crossed, his signature cocky smirk firmly in place. Nearby, a pair of lackeys loaded crates into a truck, their movements hurried but practiced. Langston's heart pounded as he snapped a few photos with his phone, each click feeling louder than the last. Just as he slid back into the shadows, his foot nudged a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the ground. "Who's there?" Grayson barked, his hand moving to the firearm holstered at his side. Langston held his breath, his mind racing. The seconds stretched, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Check it out," Grayson ordered, motioning to one of his men. Langston slipped deeper into the maze of crates, his pulse hammering in his ears. He couldn't let them find him. Not yet. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, but he knew this was his chance. If he ran now, everything he'd uncovered would disappear with those crates. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Langston ducked behind another stack, his grip tightening on his phone. He tapped out a quick message to Mitchell. "Warehouse evidence being moved. Need backup now." The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. "Nothing here," the man called back. "Then get back to work," Grayson snapped. Langston exhaled softly, relief washing over him, but he knew it wouldn't last. Back at his hotel an hour later, Langston paced the room, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The photos and videos he'd captured were a start, but they weren't enough to blow the operation wide open. He needed more. His phone buzzed Mitchell again. "What's going on?" Mitchell asked, his voice edged with urgency. "I found them," Langston said. "They're moving evidence out of town. Grayson was there." "Do you have proof?" "Photos and video," Langston replied. "But it's not enough. They're too good at covering their tracks." Mitchell was silent for a moment. "You need to be careful, Langston. They know you're on to them. If they realize how close you are, they'll come after you." Langston's jaw tightened. "They've already started." Mitchell exhaled sharply. "I'm sending agents your way, but it'll take time to put everything together. Don't take any unnecessary risks." Langston glanced at his laptop, where the photos and videos from the warehouse were already uploading to a secure folder. "I don't have time to wait, Mitchell. If we don't act now, they'll destroy everything." "Just stay alive," Mitchell said. "I'll do what I can on my end." The following morning, Langston's worst fears came to pass. As he walked out of the hotel, 2 patrol cars were parked outside, their lights flashing. Grayson leaned against the hood of one car, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Mr. Reed," he called, his voice dripping with mock civility. "We need to have a little chat." Langston froze, his mind racing. "What's this about?" Grayson straightened, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "We got a report about a disturbance at the warehouse last night, something about trespassing and theft." Langston's stomach dropped. They were setting him up. "That's ridiculous," Langston said, keeping his tone calm despite the fire burning in his chest. "Maybe," Grayson said, stepping closer. "But we'll need you to come down to the station and clear it up." 2 officers flanked Langston, their hands resting on his arms before he could respond. "I know what this is," Langston said as they led him toward the car. "And it won't work." Grayson's smirk widened. "We'll see about that." The holding cell was cold and dimly lit, the metallic clang of the door echoing long after it shut. Langston sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees. The anger simmering inside him had given way to a sharp, focused resolve. They wanted him silenced, humiliated. But they underestimated him. Hours later, Mitchell arrived, his presence a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. The FBI agent's sharp suit and calm demeanor radiated authority as he approached the cell. "You okay?" Mitchell asked, his voice low. Langston nodded. "They're desperate, that's why they pulled this stunt." Mitchell's expression hardened. "I've got agents looking into it. We'll get you out, but we need to be smart about this. If we don't move carefully, they'll bury everything." Langston stood, his gaze steady. "Then let's make sure they don't have the chance." Hours later, Langston was released, but the fight was far from over. As he stepped out of the station, Grayson was waiting, his smile now replaced by a cold, steely glare. "This isn't over," Grayson said, his voice low. "No," Langston replied, his tone sharper than steel. "It's just beginning." The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the makeshift command center. A repurposed office space in the outskirts of Millbrook. Langston stood in the center of the room, his shoulders square, his face set in determined lines. Around him, Mitchell Gray and two other FBI agents combed through files, photographs and surveillance footage. The air crackled with a tense urgency. "They're preparing to make their move tonight," Mitchell said, circling a location on a map, a large industrial site near the river. "We've traced the financial transactions to Grayson's account. This is where they're planning to offload the last of the evidence." Langston nodded, his mind racing. If they succeed, this whole case disappears. They'll have nothing to tie them to the corruption. Mitchell glanced at him, his expression grim. "This is dangerous. Langston Grayson isn't just going to back down, he's a cornered animal now." Langston looked Mitchell in the eye. "If I don't see this through, no one else will." Mitchell hesitated, then nodded. "We've got your back. But be careful. He knows we're closing in." The industrial site loomed in the darkness, its towering silos and rusted machinery casting jagged shadows under the moonlight. Langston parked his car a short distance away, his heart pounding as he stepped out into the cold night air. He'd prepared for this moment, but the weight of it still pressed heavily on his chest. He crept toward the warehouse, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes. Inside, the faint glow of lanterns illuminated a group of men working hurriedly. Langston recognized Grayson immediately, his broad frame commanding the center of the operation. Grayson's voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. "Get those crates loaded up, I want this place cleared in 20 minutes." Langston slipped into the shadows, his phone recording the scene. He knew he'd need undeniable proof to take down Grayson once and for all. But as he moved closer, the crunch of his foot against a loose metal shard betrayed him. Grayson's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. "Who's there?" Langston stepped into the light, his hands raised slightly. "It's me, Sheriff." The room froze, the workers halting mid-movement as all eyes turned to Langston. Grayson's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile. "Well, well, Mr. Reed, you've got a talent for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "I could say the same about you," Langston replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You're a public servant, Sheriff, not a kingpin." Grayson took a step forward, his hand still resting on his gun. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Langston said, holding up his phone. "And so does the FBI. This ends tonight, Grayson." For a moment, Grayson's facade slipped. His eyes flickered with something darker, fear perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by rage. He motioned to the men around him. "Get him!" The workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Langston took a step back, his voice cutting through the tension. "Think about what you're doing. If you touch me, you'll be complicit in everything he's done. Is that what you want?" The men froze, their loyalty wavering. Grayson snarled. "You're all cowards, I'll handle this myself." He drew his gun, leveling it at Langston. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of the moment pressing down like a vice. Langston stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his gaze unwavering. "You think you're untouchable," Grayson said, his voice low and venomous. You think you can walk into my town and tear everything apart? This isn't your town, Langston shot back. It belongs to the people you've been exploiting, intimidating, and silencing for years. And tonight, they get it back. Grayson's finger hovered over the trigger, his hand trembling slightly. For a moment, the room was utterly still, the only sound the distant hum of machinery. Then, the doors burst open. FBI agents flooded the warehouse, their voices sharp and commanding. "Freeze, hands in the air!" The workers scattered, dropping crates and raising their hands. Grayson's head whipped around, his grip tightening on the gun as he realized his time had run out. "Drop the weapon, Sheriff!" Mitchell's voice rang out, his gun trained on Grayson. "It's over!" Grayson's eyes darted between Langston and Mitchell, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand everything I've done. Everything. It was for this town." "Spare us the justification," Mitchell said, his voice steady. "You're under arrest. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Grayson hesitated, his knuckles white against the grip of his gun. Langston stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over, Grayson. The system you built is crumbling, and you know it." Grayson's hand faltered, the gun lowering slightly. For a moment, Langston thought he might surrender. But then, with a desperate roar, Grayson raised the weapon again, only for Mitchell to fire a single, precise shot. The gun clattered to the ground as Grayson staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Agents swarmed him, forcing him to the ground and snapping cuffs around his wrists. The room buzzed with activity as crates were secured, workers detained, and evidence catalogued. Langston stood in the center of it all, his heart pounding as he watched Grayson being led away. For the first time, the sheriff's smug arrogance was replaced by something else. Defeat. As the chaos subsided, Mitchell approached Langston, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "You okay?" Langston nodded, though his legs felt unsteady beneath him. "It's over." Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks to you, this town owes you more than it'll ever admit." Langston looked around the warehouse, the weight of the night settling over him. "There's still a lot of work to do." "And we'll do it," Mitchell said. "Together." Langston nodded, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But tonight, they'd won a battle that would echo far beyond Millbrook. Langston Reed stood in the middle of the dimly lit warehouse, the air thick with tension. The faint whir of nearby machinery hummed beneath the murmur of voices, but all other sounds faded as Sheriff Grayson stepped into the light, flanked by two deputies. His boots echoed with every step, his frame rigid with authority. The smirk on his face was one Langston had come to recognize, a mix of arrogance and disdain. "Well, well," Grayson said, stopping a few feet away. "You just can't stay out of places you don't belong, can you?" Langston stood his ground, his hands at his sides, his pulse steady. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." Grayson's smirk widened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't, Mr. Reed. I warned you, didn't I?" "You warned me that this town doesn't take kindly to outsiders," Langston said, his voice calm but firm. "What you didn't say was that you and your friends are the ones keeping it that way." Grayson took a step closer, his hands resting on his hips, inches from the holstered gun at his side. The deputies shifted uneasily behind him, their eyes darting between Langston and the sheriff. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Grayson sneered. "You think you can just walk in here with your money and your big city ideas and fix what doesn't need fixing?" Langston tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "What you call fixing is corruption, sheriff embezzlement, intimidation. And it ends tonight." Grayson chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You really think you're going to stop me? You think anyone here is going to listen to you over me?" He turned to his deputies. "This man's a trespasser, a threat, you know what to do." The deputies hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. One of them shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his belt. Langston raised his voice, cutting through the tension. "Before you do anything you'll regret, think about what happens next. You act now, you're complicit in everything, you're tying yourselves to him, to his crimes, and I promise you, when this comes to light, and it will, no one will protect you." Grayson's smile faltered, his jaw tightening. He turned sharply to the deputies. "Are you just going to stand there? Do your damn jobs!" One of the deputies took a step forward, his hand on his baton. but Langston didn't back down. "You're afraid, aren't you, Sheriff?" Langston said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Afraid that the lies you've built your power on are about to come crashing down." Grayson rounded on him, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Langston asked, pulling his phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen, and a recording began to play. Grayson's voice, loud and clear, from the night before. "Get those crates loaded up. I want this place cleared in 20 minutes. The deputies froze, their eyes wide as the recording continued, detailing Grayson's orders to destroy evidence. "You see, Sheriff," Langston said, lowering the phone, "you've underestimated me. I came prepared." Grayson's face contorted with fury. He lunged forward, his hand snapping to his gun, but Langston stepped back just as the warehouse doors burst open. Red and blue lights strobed through the building as FBI agents swarmed in, their voices commanding and sharp. "Sheriff Grayson!" one of them shouted. "Drop your weapon, you're under arrest!" Grayson froze, his gun half raised, his eyes darting wildly between Langston and the agents. "You can't do this!" he roared. "I'm the law here!" "You're a criminal," Langston said, his voice steady. Grayson's gun clattered to the ground as agents moved in, forcing him to his knees and slapping cuffs on his wrists. The deputies raised their hands, their faces pale as they surrendered without resistance. As Grayson was hauled to his feet, his eyes locked onto Langston, blazing with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Langston stepped closer, his gaze cold and unflinching. "Neither do you." The chaos subsided as agents secured the scene, cataloging evidence and questioning witnesses. Mitchell approached Langston, his face a mix of relief and respect. "You did it," Mitchell said. "We got him." Langston nodded, but his expression remained grim. This was just the beginning. Grayson wasn't working alone. There are others. Higher up, more protected. This doesn't stop here. Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we keep going, but tonight, you won. Take that for what it's worth." Langston exhaled slowly, the weight of the confrontation beginning to lift. "It's worth everything to the people he's hurt." Mitchell nodded. "You should be proud." Langston didn't respond. Instead, he looked out over the warehouse, where the crates of evidence were being loaded into FBI vans. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. As Langston walked back to his car, the night air sharp and cold against his skin, he couldn't shake Grayson's parting words. "This isn't over." He knew the sheriff wasn't just bluffing. The corruption in Millbrook ran deep, and dismantling it would require more than one victory. Langston paused, glancing back at the warehouse, now bathed in the glow of FBI floodlights. The uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his mind, but his resolve only strengthened. This wasn't over. But neither was he. The first rays of dawn cast a pale light over Millbrook as the last of the FBI vans rolled away from the industrial site. The warehouse, once a haven for corruption, now stood hollow and exposed, its secrets laid bare. Langston Reed stood on the edge of the scene, exhaustion settling into his bones. He'd spent the last several hours providing statements, reviewing evidence, and answering questions. The night had been long, but it had been worth it. Mitchell Gray approached, a cup of coffee in hand. "You look like hell," he said, offering it to Langston. Langston accepted it with a faint smile. "Feels like it too." Mitchell glanced back at the warehouse, now empty except for a few remaining agents. "Grayson's being processed as we speak. Racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. You name it, we've got it. He'll be lucky to see the outside of a cell in this lifetime." "And the others?" Langston asked, his voice steady, despite the weight behind the question. Mitchell nodded. "The deputies have been cooperative so far, and the evidence we pulled from the crates is damning. Financial records, communications, payoffs. It's all there. This is bigger than Grayson, though, and you were right, he wasn't working alone." Langston exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "So what happens now?" "We keep digging," Mitchell said. "Grayson was a piece of a much larger puzzle, but thanks to you, we've got a head start." Langston sipped the coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. "I didn't do this alone." Mitchell's expression softened. "No, but you pushed it forward when no one else would. That counts for something. The news broke later that day. Headlines splashed across local and regional outlets. Corruption in Millbrook exposed, Sheriff Grayson arrested in FBI sting. Reports detailed the years of exploitation, embezzlement, and intimidation orchestrated by Grayson and his network. For many in Millbrook, it was a shock. For others, it was vindication. Langston watched the coverage from his hotel room, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from allies and colleagues. A few stood out. Notes of thanks from people in Millbrook who had lived under Grayson's thumb for years. One, from Sarah, the waitress at the diner, read simply, "Thank you for standing up for us." Langston set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. The enormity of the past few days began to settle over him. He'd come to Millbrook with a vision of progress, only to uncover a system that thrived on fear and silence. Now, that system was fractured, but the fight was far from over. The courthouse was quiet when Langston arrived the next morning. Despite the chaos of the past day, Judge Miriam Holloway had agreed to meet with him. As he stepped into her chambers, the judge stood, her sharp eyes studying him. "Mr. Reed," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I've been following the news." Langston sat, his posture straight but relaxed. "It's been a busy 24 hours. Holloway leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "You've done this town a great service, but you've also stirred up a hornet's nest. Grayson wasn't the only one benefiting from the status quo." "I know," Langston said, "but this town deserves better." The judge's expression softened, though her tone remained firm. "Change is never easy, especially here. What's your next move?" Langston considered her question. "The redevelopment project is still on the table, but this isn't just about new buildings or infrastructure. It's about rebuilding trust, making sure the people here know they have a voice." Holloway nodded slowly. "You've got an uphill battle ahead of you, but if anyone can do it, I suspect it's you." Langston offered a faint smile. "I appreciate that, Judge." As he stood to leave, Holloway's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Mr. Reed. Don't forget to watch your back, this isn't over." Langston nodded. "I won't." The following week, Langston stood at the edge of a crowded town hall meeting. The room buzzed with energy, as residents discussed the fallout from Grayson's arrest and the future of Millbrook. Some voices were angry, others hopeful, but all were engaged in a way Langston hadn't seen before. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. The room quieted as all eyes turned to him. "I came to Millbrook because I saw potential," Langston began, his voice steady. "Not just in its buildings or businesses, but in its people. This town has been held back for too long by fear and corruption. But last week, we took the first step toward something better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This won't be easy," Langston continued. "Real change never is. But I believe in this town. I believe in what we can build together, and I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." Applause erupted, and Langston felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, it felt like Millbrook was ready to walk it. That evening, Langston sat on the steps of the old courthouse, the cool night air wrapping around him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from Mitchell. "Good work today, stay sharp." Langston smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "Always." As he set the phone aside, he let himself breathe. The fight wasn't over. Grayson's arrest was just the beginning, and the deeper corruption still needed to be unearthed. But for the first time, Langston felt the tide beginning to turn. He wasn't just fighting against a broken system anymore. He was fighting for something better. And he wasn't alone. Langston Reed stood on the balcony of his downtown office, gazing out over the city skyline as it glowed against the night. The chaos of the past few weeks was finally beginning to subside, leaving him with space to reflect. Millbrook, with its cracked sidewalks and stubborn resistance to change, had been a crucible, one that tested not just his patience, but his resolve. He'd gone there with the intention of building infrastructure, but he'd left, having laid the foundation for something far greater, the possibility of justice. Langston had always believed in the power of resilience, but he had never felt its weight as keenly as he had in Millbrook. The town had pushed him to his limits, forcing him to confront not only the blatant hostility of men like Sheriff Grayson, but also the quieter, more insidious forces that sought to maintain the status quo. Every dismissive glance, every skeptical remark, every veiled threat, they were reminders of the unspoken barriers that still shape the lives of black men and women in America. But those moments, painful as they were, also revealed something else: the power of persistence. In Millbrook, Langston learned that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged when courage was met with strategy and conviction. Grayson's arrest was proof of that, a crack in the armor of corruption that had long shielded the powerful in Millbrook. Langston had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd always been a man of action, a builder who measured progress in tangible results: skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, schools that opened their doors to underserved communities. But his time in Millbrook taught him that progress wasn't always visible at first. Sometimes, it was the quiet shift in attitudes, the subtle emboldening of voices that had been silenced for too long. He saw that shift in the faces of Millbrook's residents. There was Sarah, the waitress who had once avoided eye contact, but now spoke with a newfound confidence. There were the business owners who had once dismissed his ideas, but were now asking how they could contribute to the redevelopment project. And there were the children he passed on the street, whose laughter carried a hope that had been absent before. Langston realized that his fight wasn't just about Millbrook, it was about every town, every community, where fear and prejudice had taken root. It was about the systems that perpetuated those injustices, and the people brave enough to challenge them. His victory over Grayson was just one step in a much larger journey. A journey that required more than individual success. It required collective effort, the willingness of many to stand together against the tide. The broader implications of his struggle were clear. Millbrook was a microcosm of a larger societal issue: the intersection of systemic racism, abuse of power, and the erosion of trust in institutions. Grayson wasn't just an individual villain, he was a product of a system that had allowed him to thrive. His downfall was a reminder that accountability wasn't just about punishing bad actors, it was about dismantling the structures that enabled them. Langston thought about the conversations he'd had with Mitchell Gray in the aftermath of Grayson's arrest. Together, they'd pored over the evidence, connecting the dots that revealed a sprawling network of corruption. Judges, business leaders, and even state officials had their hands in the pot, each benefiting from the exploitation of Millbrook's most vulnerable residents. The work ahead was daunting, but it was necessary. "Justice is a marathon, not a sprint," Mitchell had said. Those words stayed with Langston. He knew the fight would continue long after the headlines faded, long after the immediate victories were celebrated. But that was the nature of progress. It was messy, incremental, and often exhausting. And yet, it was worth every step. As Langston reflected, he thought about the lessons he wanted to share, not just with the people of Millbrook, but with anyone willing to listen. He wanted them to understand that injustice, no matter how deeply rooted, could be challenged. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And that change, though slow and often painful, was always possible. He thought of the next generation, the young men and women who would inherit the world he was fighting to improve. They were watching, learning from the choices people like him made. He wanted them to see that standing up for what was right wasn't just a moral obligation, it was a transformative act, one that could ripple outward and inspire others to do the same. Langston felt a deep sense of responsibility, but also hope. Grayson's arrest had sparked conversations across Millbrook and beyond, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about their institutions and their own roles within them. It was a start, a small one, but a start, nonetheless. The road ahead was uncertain. The forces of resistance would regroup, finding new ways to protect their power and silence dissent. But Langston knew he wouldn't be alone. In Millbrook, he'd seen the power of collective action. Neighbors supporting one another, allies stepping up when it mattered most. He believed in that power, in the resilience of communities willing to fight for their future. As he turned back toward his desk, Langston opened his laptop and began drafting his next steps. The redevelopment project would move forward, but so would his work to expose the broader network of corruption uncovered in Millbrook. He reached out to Mitchell, outlining a plan to engage state and federal authorities. He contacted community leaders in Millbrook, inviting them to take a more active role in shaping their town's future. Langston knew he couldn't do it all himself, and that was the point. Real change didn't come from one person, it came from many, working together with a shared purpose. The events in Millbrook left an indelible mark on Langston's life. They reminded him of the strength required to challenge injustice and the power of solidarity in the face of adversity. But perhaps most importantly, they reinforced his belief in the potential of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. As he finished his work for the evening, Langston paused, his gaze drifting once more to the city lights outside. He thought about the people of Millbrook, the fight they'd joined, and the hope they now carried. He thought about the battles yet to come, and the victories waiting to be won. And he smiled, because even in the face of uncertainty, Langston knew one thing for sure: progress was possible. All it took was the courage to begin.